guys and gals? Me, Mutahar, and today, welcome to another episode of Haunted Gaming, the series where we take a look at the darker side of video games. Now today we actually have a look at Sweet Home, the game that actually created, or rather inspired, the entire franchise of Resident Evil. I've been kind of playing through the Resident Evil games throughout this year, and I figured, after beating all of them, I haven't played through any of the newer Revelation titles or anything of the sort. There's a whole bunch of Resident Evil games your boy hasn't looked into, and I'll look into them in due time, don't worry. But I wanted to look at the original inspiration for Resident Evil anyways, and that is Sweet Home. For those of you who've never heard of it, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Sweet Home, but for those of you who've never heard of it, it was a 1989 game created by yours truly, Capcom, the original creators of Resident Evil, of course. They actually created Sweet Home for the NES. This was a film tie-in game, and I know that sounds like a pretty awful word to be saying, film tie-in game, but don't worry, this doesn't carry the same stigmatism because it's actually a pretty good game. Now, a lot of people would recommend that Resident Evil would be the original survival horror game, but again, it is actually Sweet Home that brought what Resident Evil really was. In fact, there's a stark amount of similarities between Resident Evil 1 and Sweet Home, not just in the home setting or anything of that sort, item management, whatever. Both are Capcom games after all, but Sweet Home was the one that really brought survival horror, at least to a thing. Resident Evil might have popularized it, but Sweet Home was the original title all around. The game centers around the plot of the movie that it's tied in with, the same name, Sweet Home if anything, where a documentary film crew goes to an old mansion and they find these amazing fresco paintings. That's what they're going for. But over here, they want to go get these paintings, revive them, things like that, showcase them off, but they realize once they find this makeshift grave of this toddler, that the late mom is actually haunting the house entirely, and, well, short story is you don't want to break into this mansion, okay? The bad things happen. The game itself, it's based around the game, but it's got a whole lot more backstory to it. It's actually built more. It is actually what is a movie tie-in game, if anything. If you ever played a game that's tied into a movie, you almost realize that the game has to add more content to it just to suffice that you need to play it longer than, what, an hour and a half that the movie typically would be, which is what this game kind of is. And if you actually think about it, film crew, story, creepy home, fucked up family. Yeah, it's actually Resident Evil 7 Sewer Gators if you think about it. That tape from the demo of Resident Evil 7, yeah, it's actually a pretty nice homage if you think about it. The game is survival horror, but with role-playing elements, and if that is a combo that weirds you out, trust me, I played games that have involved stealth action, trading card games, and turn-based strategy. Now don't go thinking this game is Final Fantasy or anything of the sort, people. It's actually a game that has very good elements of survival horror and the RPG mixed together. For example, the game does have the limited healing items, if anything. You have basically a limited pot of health in this entire game, which again is very reminiscent of a survival horror game. Limited ammunition, limited health. You got to be careful. There's a level, as soon as you do get close to the level cap, or even hit it, the only thing that can kill you in this game is the final boss. You don't have to worry about the level cap. If you grind through it, you're going to be just fine. But again, you have to realize you have a pot of health, you have a pot of limited resources, so survival horror instincts better kick in. You can't just shoot your way through every enemy in a survival horror game. You have to play smart, play accordingly to your situation, and try to conserve whatever you can for a reasonable amount. Now, in this game, every party member you have, 5 in total, has a unique item. One of them has a lighter, a camera, healing kits, a vacuum cleaner, which, trust me, is a lot more useful than it may even seem in this situation, and finally a lockpick. Now these items are actually needed to win the game, but it comes with a caveat, alright? You can actually lose your party members, and that does affect the ending for this game too. I'm not going to touch upon those because I actually do want you to play them, but every time you lose a character, it actually comes across with a gory scene, if anything, and which is a plus, by the way. But don't lose all your party members because this isn't like any other JRPG, really. Once you lose a party member, they're gone. They don't come back. You can pick up a item that their key item and use it, you know, to figure out the puzzles, because again, you do need the items. It would be game breaking if you lost the ability to, say, use the lockpick or anything of the sort, or the camera. But if you lose a party member, they're gone, and it does affect the ending entirely. Another thing to mention too with this game is the variance of QuickTime Events. If you thought that Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 made QuickTime Events the most popular thing this side of the world, you'd be hard-pressed to know that you are blatantly wrong, because this game actually introduced QuickTime Events entirely. So, for example, sometimes there could be a trap that occurs, like a quick example is a chandelier falling. The game will give you choices to make, like jump left or jump right or do whatever, so on and so forth. If you don't make the right decision, or you don't make a decision at all because there is a limited time, of course, QuickTime Event, obviously, or sometimes it can be story related for sure, and if you don't make the right decision, you're going to say bye to one of your 5 friends, and if you lose any one of these people, trust me, it gets kind of difficult. Because of the limited pot of health, you're losing essentially a fifth of whatever you had. Item management becomes a key resource here as well too. If you ever played Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and 7 as well, you realize that item management becomes a huge deal. 4 as well, but in 1 to 3 you have slots. In this game you have slots as well. You have to actually manage them between your party members as well. There are points in the game where you have to split your party members up to tackle on things easily or efficiently, and in that case you have to realize how many healing items does one team get versus the other. Am I splitting the right members into the right teams, because there are different strengths of different characters. It's a whole bunch of meta stuff you have to figure out before you actually play the game, which can be kind of daunting. For me it was, but after a couple tries and a few failures, I eventually got the hang of it and pushed on through all I needed to. The story for this game is actually really interesting as well too. It's what I like to call optional storytelling. Think of it like Doom or Gears of War, if you will, which are terrible examples in the grand scheme of things. But in the end, they kind of make sense. They have a grandiose world around them that exists, but they are hidden amongst notes, letters, or optional things that you find. Almost like BioShock, if you will, too, where a lot of the story was absorbed through audio logs and things of the sort. And that's how you pick up story. And if it's done right, of course, in video games it's perfect. If it's overdone, then it just rubs you the wrong way. But the story is obtained entirely through this medium, which has a reason for existing too, which we'll get to. The cutscenes actually exist in this game. It has optional cutscenes, kind of like Ninja Gaiden, if you will. It has cinematic style things for the NES, which use some really gory imagery. Trust me, in this game, the NES graphics are used to its full advantage. You actually get to see some pretty interesting stuff like skeletons being burned down or, bloody events occurring, of course, within the confines of what the NES can actually deliver. In fact, that's all the game really has to scare the actual user themselves. This is a survival horror game, if you will, after all. Takuro Fujiwara, the game director at the time, was actually pretty pissed off, I guess you could say, or at least challenged, or the toughest aspect of this was actually trying to get graphics to be conveyed across, because with any horror game, one of the biggest things in my argument is the graphics, alright? In such a case, graphics become your biggest friend, because for a horror game to ever deliver an effect on you, it has to be visually and, it has to strike you visually, it has to strike you through sound, it has to strike you through all those. It has to build atmosphere. One of my favorite horror games, if anything, was... One of my favorite horror games that I actually played was Outlast. I didn't really bother getting too much into Outlast 2, but I definitely played the hell out of Outlast 1. What I really liked about it was the fact that it had a horror setting that I could really immerse myself into. You had the sound working against you, you had creepy characters stalking you throughout the areas. You had an entire visual spectrum hitting you all at once. It looked good, it fit the mood. Another game like Manhunt for me really mattered a lot too, because it gave you a dark environment that you could immerse yourself within. Resident Evil 7 does the same within. The PT horror demo did the same. Graphics matter a lot when it comes to a horror game. NES games, let's be serious, couldn't scare you back in the day, and they still couldn't scare you now. But what the developers did at the time was introduce those notes and those letters that I mentioned earlier. By doing that, they actually created a creepy atmosphere, if you will. They tried to do the best they could with the cutscenes, if anything, but of course with the limitations of the NES's graphics chips, NES graphics hardware, if anything, couldn't really match up to what the developers really wanted at the end of the day. Sure, there were creepy enemies like dolls or ghosts, but they don't really do much. I mean, I guess if you play the game at 3 in the morning by yourself, maybe you might feel a little bit spooked, but as a whole, Sweet Home wasn't ever really a scary game. But it was a fun game, and it was a game that really did provoke you in thought. It was an entire experience. It's like being in a horror Japanese movie, if anything. It's a fun experience if you can sit through it. I'd recommend you give it a shot. Why not? It is a Japanese-only game, but don't worry, there is an English translation available, which is how I did it. English translation communities for these kind of games are pretty strong, so if Nanashi No Game can have it, I'm sure the original survival horror game Sweet Home definitely has a fan translation community around it, and does. But that's sort of the whole thing about Sweet Home, ladies and gentlemen. It was a game that I encountered, I ended up playing, and I did actually really enjoy from front to end. Sure, it wasn't a game that I go back to anytime soon, and it is a frustrating JRPG, if anything, from a time where JRPGs were known to be somewhat frustrating, but it was an interesting game, and I'd recommend you give it a shot, and ultimately it does fit in the spectrum of haunted gaming. It was the first scary game, if anything, and I'd recommend giving it a shot, ladies and gentlemen. If you are a fan of Resident Evil, if you're a fan of anything like that, if you're a fan of Silent Hill, if you're a fan of any of those survival horror games, you owe it to yourself to give Sweet Home a little bit of a shot. But that being said, I'm going to head back to Shin Megami Tensei, and hopefully you'll have a video similar to that soon, or maybe an ARG. That being said, this has been another episode of Haunted Gaming. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Just like if you dislike it. I am out.